Good evening. Today we're going to be going over how oxygen binds the heme in the body, um, as well as how different the various binding capacities of oxygen in different compartments of the body are. So without further ado, we're going to go over a group presentation, group advanced presentations, number 3. So we're going to start off with red blood cells. They're also known as erythrocytes. Um, Erythrocytes are unlike any cells in the body in the sense that they have no nucleus and almost no organelles. Um, they also contain structural proteins such as actin and spectrin. These proteins help with the resiliency and elasticity of red blood cells. Um, so some of these red blood cells, erythrocytes, can actually bend, and they have to in these narrow capillaries and vessels. They're donut shaped, and the most important protein is hemoglobin, which makes up the vast majority of the cell. Um, the hemoglobin protein, otherwise the hemoglobin molecule, they're made up of 4 polypeptide chains. Um, there's 2 alpha and 2 beta chains. There's 4 heme groups, 4 iron molecules, and each iron molecule allows the protein to bind up to 1 oxygen molecule. So each hemoglobin molecule can bind up to 4 oxygen molecules. An interesting fact about the hemoglobin molecule is that there's about 270 million of these molecules per red blood cell, and red blood cells are about, each person has about 20 to 30 trillion red blood cells in the human body, which accounts for about 25% of all the um, cells in the human body. So now when hemoglobin binds to 1 oxygen molecule, it actually changes the shape so that the other 3 sites are more likely to bind to the additional oxygen molecules. This is called cooperative binding. Um, and so it helps, so by binding to 1 site, the other 3 sites are facilitated through phase changes in the polypeptide chains. And another important thing to note is, how does hemoglobin know when to deliver the oxygen molecules, right? It doesn't know what part of the body it's in. Um, the hemoglobin molecules could be in your thigh, could be in your lungs. You don't want the oxygen to dissociate in your lungs before it reaches the crucial parts of your body cells that really needs them. So a concept called allosteric inhibition occurs where the CO2 and the hydrogen protons in your body binds to parts of the hemoglobin molecule, which causes the protein to dissociate from the oxygen. Um, so during exercise, your body cells actually produce a lot of CO2, and that CO2 binds to the hemoglobin that is traveling through the body. Um, by binding to the hemoglobin molecule, um, you have the oxygen on a hemoglobin molecule dissociating from it, so which that oxygen gets delivered and used up by the cells needed. Um, Most of the CO2 in the body actually gets converted into carbonic acid by combining with water in the body. So the body is about 70% water. Here's the equation of water combining with carbon dioxide, forming carbonic acid. Um, okay, now we're going to go over oxygen transport systems and pressures. Um, so there's different partial pressures of oxygen in different components of the body, um, or different organs of the body. So the partial pressure of oxygen is higher in the lungs. It's about 100 torrs versus the rest of the body, such as the tissues, which is about 20 torrs. So you can see the rest of the body has a lower partial pressure of oxygen. Um, At lower pressures of partial pressures of oxygen, the hemoglobin molecule actually has poor oxygen affinity, but at higher pressures, hemoglobin's molecules have good oxygen affinity, which helps explain why hemoglobin can bind to oxygen so well, but releases it and it is a poor oxygen binder in the rest of the body. It binds really well in the lungs because of the high pressure, high partial pressure, and releases it and is a poor binder in the rest of the body because of the lower partial pressure. Um, and then we're going to go over pH and oxygen transport. Um, at lower pHs, there's a lower affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. At higher pHs, there's a higher affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen. And we know that from basic looking at the CO2 concentration of the body, that the CO2 is highest in the tissues because they're using energy and producing CO2 as a waste product. That CO2, as a result, also lowers the overall pH of the environment. And because um, the overall pH of the environment is lowered, the affinity for oxygen, the bind of hemoglobin, is lowered. CO2 bonds to the polypeptide part of the hemoglobin, not the heme. So that's an important factor to note. The heme really binds to just the oxygen molecules, not the CO2. Um, and here I'm showing you guys a oxygenation curve of hemoglobin. Um, Basically, this is a visual representation of um, the hemoglobin saturation of the body, and it basically visually confirms that at higher pressures, the affinity for oxygen binding is better. Um, on the x-axis, it has the partial pressure of oxygen. So at higher partial pressures, the binding of oxygen is higher. At lower pressures, it's a lot lower. And thank you.